welcome. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's lecture by Kevin Kopelson, Grant Wood's Artwork, Dream Work, and Literary Work, which will be followed by a response from Terry Castle. The occasion for this program is, of course, the incredible survey of Grant Wood's work, American Gothic and Other Fables, which is on view on the 5th floor. And in case you didn't know, today is the final day of the exhibition, so I hope you've all had a chance to see it or will immediately following the talk. The exhibition takes its title from Wood's most well-known work, American Gothic, the double portrait of a pitchfork-wielding farmer and a woman commonly presumed to be his wife, which is one of the most recognizable paintings in 20th century American art. But the exhibition also demonstrates that Wood's career consists of far more than one single painting and brings together the full range of his art, from his early arts and crafts, decorative objects, and impressionist oils, through his mature paintings, murals, and book illustrations. And I want to thank my colleagues Barbara Haskell, who curated the exhibition, and Sarah Humphreyville, who assisted her on this project. Today's lecture looks at Grant Wood through a literary lens, considering Wood's relationship to writing in his approach to making visual art. In doing so, Kevin Kopelson reframes Wood in an alternative literary tradition, stretching from Mark Twain to David Sedaris, the subject of Kevin's 2007 monograph. This literary approach to programming for an art exhibition is the result of a collaboration between the Whitney and the London Review of Books to bring together our respective perspectives on art and literature. Our two esteemed speakers are both regular American contributors to the LRB, and I want to thank Sam Kinchin-Smith at the LRB for working closely with me on developing the program, and hopefully you found a copy of the most recent issue of the LRB and a card also that lists this program as well as another upcoming program here in New York City. So I'll introduce our two speakers and then turn things over to them. Kevin Kopelson is Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Iowa, where he specialized in critical theory, cultural studies, queer theory, and 20th century literature. He's published numerous articles, book reviews, and 7 books, including most recently Adorno and the Showgirl, or Late Style in 2016, and Confessions of a Plagiarist and Other Tales from School in 2012. Kevin has invited Terry Castle, Professor of English Literature at Stanford University, to offer a response to his talk today. Terry specializes in the history of the novel, but she has taught a wide variety of other subjects too, including the literature of the First World War, British modernism, Virginia Woolf, Radcliffe Hall, and other 20th century women writers, psychoanalytic theory, literature and opera, and gay and lesbian writing. She's written 7 books, most recently The Professor, A Sentimental Education, 2010, and I was just getting her to tell me about her work as an artist, which she does in addition to all of that. So the program is about an hour and 15 minutes, and following both talks, Kevin and Terry will also come to the stage to take questions if folks have them. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Kopelson.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for attending. Terry Castle and I were introduced to one another about 25 years ago by the late Diane Wood Middlebrook, no relation, I believe, to Grant Wood. I miss Diane a lot. She was a great friend and also a great critic, and so I'd like to dedicate this presentation to the memory of her. I grew up in Queens, not that far, incidentally, from where the artist Joseph Cornell was still living on Utopia Parkway at the time. One oddity for me growing up there, or at least in the house we had there, was that I spent a lot of time looking at a reproduction of Stone City, an oil painting done by Grant Wood in 1930. Our parents, for some reason, had had this reproduction framed and hung in the laundry room. I did not know what the place, Stone City, represented here was. I could not possibly have known a limestone quarry when I saw one, let alone an abandoned one. I did not know where in Iowa it was. I did not even know where Iowa was. One irony for me in later life, as I've had an almost 30-year career teaching literature at the University of Iowa has been that I have lived almost all of that time not that far from the real Stone City. I now think, or imagine, that I just thought or felt that this Stone City place in the painting looked pretty dreamy. I may even have felt it to be rather inscrutable. What kind of hills are these? I'd have asked myself. What kind of trees are these? Whose woods these were, I could not know. And what are those poles supposed to be? And are those tiny things billboards? Such artwork is, of course, inscrutable, as has been recognized by various critics. Jeffrey O'Brien, for instance, in a New York Review of Books piece on the Grant Wood exhibition here at the Whitney, says of a rather more famous painting, also done by Wood in 1920, I don't think I'm alone in not having known quite what to make of American Gothic. Who were these people? What was the import of the painting? Why was it everywhere? The image imposed itself too early for there to be any question of liking or disliking it. It was there, an outlying oddity somehow definitively entrenched, folksy, quaint, even a bit menacing if you really attempted to look into the eyes of that terminally dour and unappeasable man or tried to imagine what the woman was feeling. Fear? Discontent? A shared sorrow? Or exactly where her gaze was directed? What these critics do not recognize, though, is that this inscrutability is due to the fact, understood by the artist himself, that while Wood produced work much the way all dreamers dream, he also, and simultaneously, did so much the way many writers write. For while these two modes of production overlap in some respects, they do not otherwise have much in common. We know that Wood produced work the way dreamers dream because he said so, at first in a dedication speech for a mural done by students. "Come with me to the Imagination Isles," he said. "No human being can visit these islands. Only the spirit can come. There we may live as long as we please in our choice of mother-of-pearl palaces, without fear of intruding upon anyone or of anyone intruding upon us. It is very difficult to find people who can produce this material of dreams. A very, very few people have this ability so strongly marked in youth that they are set apart and given special training. These people become musicians and poets and painters. They are valuable because they can lead others into the delightful land where their spirits are trained to dwell." There is a reproduction of the mural along with the text of the entire speech in the exhibition here. And we know what dream work is in reality, according to psychoanalysis. It is the almost totally obscure expression, via two rhetorical tropes in particular, metaphor and metonymy, or condensation and displacement, of otherwise repressed unconscious material. Desire primarily, and also memory, and sometimes dread. Metonymy is a rhetorical trope in which an object is used to describe something or someone closely related to it. When you're talking about a king or queen, for instance, you could say metonymically, the crown. The dreamer, moreover, is both in the dream as a character within a primarily visual proto-narrative, even if not there as him or herself, and out of the dream as what can be called its one and only viewer. Not surprisingly, then, both American Gothic and Stone City, along with other such paintings by Wood, have been read by critics along the lines of these basic rules of dream interpretation. Emily Braun, for instance, notes in a catalog essay done for the exhibition that eyeglasses worn by Wood in one's self-portrait are a metonym. She calls them a metonym for intense focus, something that presumably any viewer of the painting should be able to discern. Braun also says there that the glasses function paradoxically as a distancing device between the artist and the viewer, despite the piercing directness of the figure's gaze. But she may well have also called the glasses, for the artist alone, I'd say, a metonym for Grant Wood's father, named Miraval, who died quite suddenly when this middle son of his was only 10. Miraval's glasses, you see, were the one personal item of his that this poor bereaved 10-year-old was allowed to keep. In later life, upon return to Cedar Rapids, Iowa from Munich, where in 1928 Wood had helped to produce a stained glass window he had designed, and where he had been totally bowled over by the work of Northern Renaissance masters like Hans Memling, he then ordered a replica of those very glasses, or rather of their frames, for himself. This encounter with Memling and others at the Alte Pinakothek in Munich inspired Wood, he claimed, to quite suddenly renounce, not that I myself thinks that's the right word to use, his early impressionist style, and turn to the, let's just say not regionalism, but realism, with which after 1930 he'd soon become so closely associated and also for which he'd become celebrated. And so the self-portrait figure may well have represented, metaphorically and for Wood alone on some level, a combination of both father shown metonymically and son shown iconographically, a combination, that is, of old man Miraval and young man Grant. This, as it happens, is similar to how Wood's most recent biographer, R. Tripp Evans, has understood the two figures in American Gothic. The male figure, wearing those same eyeglasses, may well have represented, metonymically and for Wood alone, says Evans, Father Merville. The female figure, for whom the artist's younger sister, while wearing their mother's apron as well as her cameo pin modeled, may well have represented for Wood alone Sister Nan herself, shown iconographically, Mother Hattie herself, shown metonymically, and also a metaphorical combination of the two. Merville's connection to this work, says Evans, explains Wood's curious vacillation concerning the two figures' relationship. The artist routinely insisted that the couple represented a father and daughter, yet on at least one occasion he referred to the male figure as the woman's husband. This possibly unintentional slip is rendered doubly strange when, in the course of the same interview, Wood cites the appropriateness of using his maiden sister for the female figure. To suggest that the woman in American Gothic was both a maiden as well as a married woman was as odd as his implication that Nan herself had been unmarried when she posed for him. Although she continued to live with Wood and Hattie apart from her husband, Nan had in fact been married for 6 years by 1930. In Wood's mind, of course, Evans continues, all of these contradictions were resolved by Nan's dual imaginary roles in the image. She represents the still married Hattie as well as Miraval's grown unmarried daughter. Similarly, although husband and father would appear to represent mutually exclusive categories, the two roles were naturally wed in the figure of Miraval, whose context changed with Nan's inclusion, but not his identity. Not that either the self-portrait by Wood or American Gothic can be said in writer's workshop parlance, often falsely attributed to the novelist Henry James, to tell us, or rather to have perhaps told Wood alone, any of this. The two works simply, as I've already hinted, may have shown it to him on some level. For contrary to what Evans seems to assume, we cannot be sure that Wood himself would have understood consciously what it was that he may have been shown by them, much as no one not under the care of a competent analyst will soon understand what some dream they've just had must mean. As for Stone City, along with other dreamy landscapes done by Wood, here is Evans' interpretation. Incidentally, you can buy the biography along with the exhibition catalog in the store downstairs. And I should preface this by simply telling you, as does Evans repeatedly, that the artist, no matter how little gay sex, sodomitical or otherwise, he may have had in real life, was a closeted homosexual. We might know more for sure on this subject had that sister of his, Nan, not destroyed upon Wood's death at age 50 all of the man's correspondence. Although Wood, says Evans, may have disguised the sexual nature of his landscapes, even to a certain degree from himself, the object of his desire is only partially abstracted in these works, for in the undeniably erotic curves of Stone City, we register the muscular outlines of a powerful male body. And, adds Evans, not only does Wood in this painting reveal his reverence for the male body, he also suggests its potential for penetration. In the curiously clefted hill that appears in the painting's upper right-hand corner, the viewer registers a pair of rounded, passively upturned buttocks, firmly belted by an encircling road They are penetrated at their base by a felicitously placed tree. Got wood, one might well exclaim, if that is, one happens to be a billboard. Or if one is not such a thing, one might perhaps exclaim, ow. The larger of the two billboards here, by the way, is for a cigarette, the Chesterfield cigarette. They satisfy, it proclaims to, or rather, the billboard tells its careful viewer. Seriously, though, this type of dream interpretation of work by Wood, interpretation that will often, as with Evans, attribute to any viewer perceptions Wood alone on some level may have had, isn't always all that silly, or perhaps all that wish-fulfilling on the interpreter's part, as it often seems to be on Evans. But nor, alas, is such dream interpretation tout court all that uncommon nowadays. Even O'Brien, in the New Yorker Review of Books, says, although the region of Wood's regionalism is a narrow one, nearly claustrophobic, drawing on images of a past already imaginary, he did for a time find a way to work it into a spaciousness of his own invention, a transfigured and pervasively sexualized landscape, and I almost always read that as perversely sexualized landscape, embodied in dream trees, dream fields, dream corn, dream ribbons of roadway or water, landscapes having only the most tenuous relationship to the actual, and certainly no hint of actual dirt or dust. Tenuous? May I just tell you, what with my having lived for so long in eastern Iowa, the part of the state that Wood himself lived in for most of his life, and also that he portrayed most often, with American Gothic the sole exception to this rule, the place really does, in large part, look like this. Just imagine it without the seemingly impossible bird's-eye perspective presented here in Stone City, as in other such work by Wood. It is this perspective, I think, being both in and out of any proto-narrative portrayed that provides the most basic sense of dreaminess. Just imagine it, moreover, without all the multiple and utterly impossible vanishing points presented. Live in the dream, as so many of us in Iowa, with both deliberate and rather obvious irony, will so often, well, ejaculate at one another there. Trees throughout the state, though, do not look quite this perfect, at least from below on the ground, what with the tallest of them having been blown apart by our all too frequent blizzards and even tornadoes. I once suggested to the Iowa City Chamber of Commerce, with much the same irony, that the state motto should be weather from around the world. The motto at the moment, and by the way, it does seem to change a lot, is our liberties we prize and our rights we will maintain. Well, we'll see about that. But let's go back to Queens for a somewhat long moment, or back to not so dreamy Queens, and to that neighbor of ours, Joseph Cornell. He is a man whose life, in several respects, as well as whose artwork in at least one respect, have a lot in common with those of Grant Wood. Both men lost their fathers when still very young. Cornell was 13 at the time. Wood, as I've said, was only 10. Both men ended up, long into adulthood, living in extremely cramped quarters with their widowed mother plus a sibling, Cornell with a younger brother named Robert, Wood with his sister Nan. Both men had non-normative, but let's just say queer sexualities, what with Wood's, to judge, as does Evans, from artwork I won't deal with today, as well as from, well, various impressions shared publicly after Wood's death by friends of his, as well as by students. What with Wood's being oriented toward rather hunky young farmhands and assistants, and what with Cornell's, much like Humbert Humbert, the narrator of the novel Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, being oriented toward much too young women, and even, I suspect, pre-adolescent girls. And yet, or rather, and so both men seem to have been, until almost the very end, in Cornell's case, lifelong celibates. Both men, moreover, were obsessed with the past, much like Mark Twain and Marcel Proust as quasi-autobiographical novelists, or even like the quasi-novelistic, quasi-autobiographical essayist David Sedaris. They were obsessed in particular with their childhoods. Cornell, it should be said, was also obsessed with the far more distant past. Plus, both men had a terrible sweet tooth. And by the way, I think that somebody truly qualified, like Terry Castle, should do an extensive study of Wood and Cornell together. Cornell's work, though, unlike that of Wood, is primarily dreamy. As such, it is dreamy in a way the latter, having been equally shaped by a literary mode of production, is not. Plus, Wood's work, as I have already indicated, can be dreamy in a way that Cornell's cannot. That is to say, one finds there, or rather, Wood himself on some level may have found there, not just unconscious memory and desire expressed through metaphor, metonymy, and also iconography. One finds dread as well. Here's a fairly obvious instance of this, which I will return to at the end of this talk. One finds in Cornell's work, or rather Cornell himself may have found there, just memory and desire. There's no dread at all, or at least none that I alone, while imagining myself to be in Cornell's position as the primary, if not the only viewer of his work, can detect. By contrast, by the way, the artist John Stewart Curry, a fellow regionalist of Wood's, worked in a primarily literary, or at least narrative way. There's no dreaminess there at all, or at least none that I alone, once again, can detect. And Terry, you may want to throw some Curry into that study of yours. Cornell, as you all may know, was the so-called outsider and, in fact, rather eccentric artist who was most famous for such beautiful, if at times disturbing, shadow box assemblages as Medici Slot Machine. All such work, literarily, is both romantic in the most general sense of the term as it is applied to artwork, and symbolist, as well as quite deliberately, and yet, at least to anyone other than the artist himself, only ever obscurely autobiographical. All such work by Cornell also subdivides, literarily, although not all that neatly, into a somewhat surrealist period, and then a somewhat neo-romanticist period, and then a somewhat abstract expressionist one. I say somewhat here, much as I said eccentric just a second ago, because Cornell himself never considered himself to be a full-fledged member of any of these aesthetic movements. He did, though, consider himself both romantic and symbolist. Well, I would now like, as we say in school, to unpack, and to unpack at quite some length, Medici Slot Machine. Don't worry, this part will not be on the exam. I hope thereby to show how doing dream interpretation of such work by Cornell can pretty much cover just about everything it's probably trying to signify. The desire expressed here, though, is not for any particular Lolita in Cornell's own life, or rather in his fantasy life. The desire expressed, which isn't sexual in any way I can discern, is for that younger brother of his, Robert, who was sadly very disabled, and whom for various reasons, including that despite or maybe because of his disability, the poor guy had a very sweet, sunny, and sociable disposition, unlike Brother Joseph, who was just lugubrious, and whom, for various reasons, the artist just adored. This particular shadow box may well be Cornell's most famous artwork, much as American Gothic is that of Grant Wood. As you can see, it is quite classical in style, at least insofar as it is almost perfectly balanced and symmetrical. A large central figure is flanked by and also looms over some lesser-sized compartments. This figure is a monochrome reproduction of almost all of a full-length and also full-color oil painting by Sofonisba Anguissola done in the middle of the 16th century. This painting, we now know, is of a 9-year-old and also, as seen here, neotenic-eyed Massimiliano Stampa, the third Marquis of some town in Italy. The two flanking compartments are filled for the most part with towers of some little wooden cubes that may well be, or are at least suggestive of, some children's blocks. These, though, are mostly covered not with letters of the alphabet, but with additional reproductions taken from the same painting by Anguissola of 9-year-old Massimiliano's face. This face of his quite clearly gazes, while looking us square in the eye, unlike the two figures in American Gothic, back at us. His body, almost all of which can be seen in the central reproduction, is completely covered in mourning clothes, although I'm pretty sure that Cornell would not have known these clothes to be this. 4 of 5 compartments below this reproduction contain for the most part some toys, some other toys, marbles, jacks, etc. They contain, in other words, some additional signs, metonymic ones, apart from those possible children's blocks above them, of an altogether happy childhood, or of a childhood that to Cornell's apparently nostalgic and therefore no doubt unreliable memory at least seems to have been happy. The fifth and central one of these, who knows why, contains a compass. Both vertical and horizontal sight lines, painted on the glass pane that covers the shadow box, emphasize not only the symmetry of everything placed behind the glass, but also the basic and therefore rather abstract grid pattern, or perhaps graph pattern, that in addition to young Massimiliano, or to his particular childhood as both imagined and idealized by Cornell, or to childhood in general as both imagined and idealized by him, the box also represents. Wood, too, in his paintings could be a rather pure, almost abstract geometrician, although not quite so classical a one as Cornell. Two such lines cross one another, like the x and y axes at the origin of a graph, on the central or largest face of Massimiliano just next to the nose. Another two cross one another on that of the compass at its very center point. This grid pattern is emphasized as well by map fragments, which by surrounding the central reproduction divide it from those two cube tower compartments on either side of it. Of course, this shadow box suggests in its iconography more than just children's blocks. It suggests the actual slot machines, or vending machines, that back in Cornell's day used to be all over New York City. He claimed, in fact, that one such machine, a certain candy machine at a subway stop, had inspired the whole series of shadow box that includes this one. Those cubes, therefore, may correspond to both children's blocks iconographically and chocolate bars metaphorically. Those marbles may correspond metaphorically to gumballs. It suggests, at least to some other critics, Cornell himself as a pre-adolescent boy. It may even have suggested Cornell himself as a supposedly happy boy to Cornell himself. But in its rather obvious sentimentality, the box may also have suggested to Cornell his brother Robert as a happy boy. It may, moreover, have also suggested to Cornell metaphorically this brother of his as a happy, healthy grown-up. For Robert here is thoroughly idealized. Not only is he still or preternaturally good-looking in that girlish way of only pre-adolescent and even some early adolescent boys, not only is he, as always, sweet, sunny, and sociable in that gaze-meeting way that I would call both childlike and dog-like, not only is he pure and innocent, like some inappropriately young girl or girlish young woman, he is standing, it would seem, without anyone's or even anything's assistance. In the painting by Anguissola, it is clear, as you can see, that Massimiliano leans on a pedestal. In the reproduction used, and probably both cropped and reversed by Cornell, this cannot be seen. And so he is no longer, praise Jesus, disabled. And so this shadow box, via the clever dream work-like use of that little old Marquise image, may have suggested to Cornell, metaphorically, both Robert and himself together. They're two sides of the same shiny and by necessity perfectly balanced vending machine coin. Or better, they're mirror images of one another, with the one, Robert, both conceived of and idealized as the far better, and yet via wishful thinking still symmetrically opposed alter ego of the other. This shadow box, then, on some level, must have been meant by Cornell and for Cornell to feel happy, although I hasten to say here that it does not really feel that way to me. The box must have been meant to feel to Cornell like a happy, wish-fulfilling dream that is both about his brother Robert and for brother Robert, but that is also both about and for the artist as viewer himself. And yet, considering that crazy title Cornell chose, Medici's Slot Machine, it must also have been meant by him, although I hasten to say here that the specifically, if secondarily, literary mode of production on the artist's part, including in particular its address to the general public, has not been confined by him to what academics would call this one paratextual, or in this particular case, titular supplement to the artwork itself. It must also have been meant by him to be, if not exactly humorous, then at least, like Robert himself in real life apparently, then at least whimsical. For it is whimsical to place, dead center, such an old artwork, the painting by Anguissola, within such a modern-day, albeit transmogrified gizmo, just as it is to put the Renaissance word Medici before the modern word slot machine. It is whimsical, moreover, to debase such a highbrow artwork as that painting of hers by encasing or framing it within something so basically commercial as that gizmo. Think here of Marcel Duchamp having drawn a mustache plus goatee upon an image of the Mona Lisa, or think of what Andy Warhol using silkscreen would later do to her. But of course, as I have already indicated, the box is far more sad for almost anyone other than Cornell than it is happy. It is far more wistful for us, or for us grown-up viewers who are now not imagining ourselves to be in Cornell's position, than it is whimsical. For it is both beautiful and pitiful, and it is both romantic and, as I've said, sentimental. Happy Childhood here is presented by Cornell, both thinking wishfully and feeling wishfully, as endless. We ourselves now know, though, never to be that nostalgic, not even in artwork. After all, whose childhood has ever been altogether happy? Certainly not that of both fatherless and disabled young Robert. We know, too, as grown-ups with a number of burdens to bear, not to mention as ones with even a tragedy or two to bear, we know that any sort of childhood must come to an end. This is probably why Cornell preferred showing and sometimes even giving his artwork to neighborhood kids he got to know, to neighborhood girls, that is, for the most part. And in case you're wondering, he never gave me any. For they, at least, or so I imagine Cornell imagined, could not yet be saddened by it. But it's time now for me to start talking, or rather for me to start reading to you some writing of mine about writing, about what it is that many writers do when writing, about which writing-like or literary activities, by extension, a visual artist like Grant Wood may have engaged in when painting, and about which such activities Wood himself does seem to have engaged in inscrutable combination with dreamlike ones, when producing the 4 paintings of his that I have already discussed. Writing is work, and by the way, this part will be on the exam. Writing is work. Writing is play as well. Writers, creative writers that is, both work and play with some or all of the following: highfalutin literary language, idiomatic language, and like you know, ordinary spoken language. Linguists incidentally call those idiotic little words either discourse markers or pragmatic particles. Literary style, literary form, including but not limited to narrative form. My own favorite one is that of the essay. Literary history, cultural history, world history, family history, personal experience, personal memory, personal imagination. Please think here of how, with so-called involuntary memory, Proust, or rather Proust's narrator in À la recherche du temps perdu, must both work and play with his imagination, among other things, so as to recreate his past in all its aesthetic truth and immediate presence, much as I feel Wood sometimes does. Interesting information, careful thought, various impressions, various emotions, humor, pathos especially, so-called sentiment, if we were a Victorian writer addicted to seemingly inauthentic emotion, as was the character Emmeline Grangerford in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, or if we are now an old-fashioned writer. Rhythm, if we're poets or just poetic writers of prose, howsoever irregular. Rhyme, if we're poets or just poetic writers of prose, howsoever irregular. Reason, if we're not poets, as most poets seem to like just posing questions without ever answering them. Rhetoric, every trope from good old-fashioned metaphor and metonymy up to and including, wait for it, irony, and ultimately, or perhaps fundamentally, the unconscious, which, although not necessarily smarter than our conscious self is, at least knows and certainly remembers other things than it does. Such writers also like to set traps for readers or for auditors like yourselves. My earlier mention of Wood's early Impressionism, for instance, was one such trap, as was my mention of Cornell's sentimentality. Such writers also both show and tell us stuff, which reminds me, they also write when they remember to, not for or rather to themselves alone, but to a specific audience. Sometimes this audience is a very limited ideal one, which almost always seems to be the case for me as a writer. It is also the case for both James and Proust, not to mention Nabokov. We call such work esoteric. Sometimes this audience is an unlimited, if not unwashed, mass one. This is the case for both Twain and Sedaris. We call such work exoteric. And this, the matter of keeping some audience in mind consciously or of non-self-directed address, is a huge difference between writing and dreaming, the latter of which, of course, is in reality an unconscious activity where we ourselves, by definition, are both producer and consumer. That's why, unless we're psychoanalysts, I'd imagine, being forced to hear someone tell us a dream they've just had is so very boring. That dream of theirs was never in any sense meant for or perhaps sent to us. Visual artists, figurative ones at any rate, may likewise both work and play with aesthetic style, impressionism, realism, etc., aesthetic form, the landscape, the portrait, the self-portrait, etc. All those kinds of history I've just mentioned, experience, memory, imagination, information, thought, impressions, emotions, sentiment, rhythm, rhyme, reason, rhetoric, and the unconscious. In other words, with everything that writers do, except for, apart from artwork, including bits like that billboard in Stone City, language. And we know that Wood produced artwork that way, just as we know he produced it the way dreamers dream, because once again, and this time just a few months before his death, he said so. Painting is much like writing, he told the Mason City Globe-Gazette at that point. We know, moreover, that after 1930, he did so quite deliberately as an exoteric artist. A work which does not make contact with the public, Wood then said, is lost. But apart from such address to the general public, in addition to himself, just what kind of exoteric artist was Grant Wood? Did he, as some critics have claimed, really produce, in order to move, to amuse, and also to instruct the masses, quasi-literary satire? Both Proust and Sedaris, incidentally, can, I think, be best understood as basically satirical. Did he, Wood, produce fable? I'd say he did not, in large part because due to the coextensive dreaminess of the work, addressed to Wood alone, he cannot possibly be said to have been a moralist. As a literary painter invested in narrative, that is, Wood may well have thought, as we all do, and so he may also have worked in terms of polar opposition, male versus female, white versus black, good versus evil, etc. Montecorn, quite aptly, speaks of Wood's narratives of confrontation. But as an equally dreamy painter invested in the unconscious, he cannot possibly be said, as can John Stuart Curry, to have worked primarily in terms of opposition. The unconscious, let me tell you, does not recognize opposition. I am not claiming, by the way, that Wood was unique in this respect. Other visual artists are no doubt best understood to have been just as dreamy as they are literary, as are some writers, like, for instance, Nabokov, as are some filmmakers, like, for instance, Robert Altman, about whom Pauline Kael in The New Yorker once wrote, "Altman probably works closer to his unconscious than any other American director. His plenitude comes from somewhere beyond reason." This is something that Evans, quoting Wood in the biography when discussing American Gothic, does get right. American Gothic's figures, he says there, of course do represent primitive and even rather terrible historical throwbacks for the artist, and certainly they recall the rigidity of the world in which he was raised. That Wood intended to ridicule these figures, however, is doubtful. As the artist himself later explained, "I admit the fanaticism and false taste of the characters in American Gothic. These people had bad points, and I did not paint them under, but to me they were basically good and solid people." It is also something that Wood himself understood, as one can tell from an essay of his called My Debt to Mark Twain, in which he discusses the only two novels that his dad, who loathed all other fiction apart from the Bible, had ever let him read. Of course, there was no moral in either The Adventures of Tom Sawyer or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Wood says there, and I should be the last to want to be banished for suggesting there was. That debt to Twain, moreover, also includes a basically literary, not to mention modernist, aversion not shared by Cornell, as I've already indicated, to pictorial sentiment. Much of the humor of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn had escaped me when I read them as a boy, Wood continues. Yet this was not always the case, and I recall distinctly that one of my earliest realizations of the humorous grew out of reading Huckleberry Finn. It was the part wherein Huck, staying with the Grangerfords, describes the sentimental pictures a daughter in the family, that would be Emmeline Grangerford, had painted before her premature death. They was different from any pictures I ever see before, Huck said, blacker mostly than is common. And of all the pictures, you will remember, the masterpiece was the unfinished study of a grief-stricken young woman ready to leap off a bridge, tears, gown, and hair flowing, and with 3 pairs of arms, all in different positions. The idea had been to see which pair of arms would look the best, and then to scratch out the other 2, but the young artist had died before she made up her mind. The young woman in the picture, Huck remarked, had a kind of nice, sweet face, but there was so many arms it made her look too spidery, it seemed to me. As I look back on it now, I realized that my response to this passage was a revelation. Having been born into a world of Victorian standards, I had accepted and admired the ornate, the lugubrious, and the excessively sentimental naturally and without question. And this was my first intimation that there was something ridiculous about sentimentality. What Grant Wood did produce, instead of satire and fable, were therefore unsentimental narrative works of both inscrutable and, inadvertent irony. They are works where the dreamer in Wood, addressing himself alone, is often at odds with the writer in Wood addressing everyone. They are works, that is, where he does not seem to be telling any of us, if not just telling himself what on the surface he seems to be showing. With sarcasm, someone addressing you clearly means the opposite of what they're saying. With irony, assuming you sense the irony, they seem to mean something other up to and including the opposite of it than what they're saying, although you can never tell exactly what. Sarcasm, you could say, is like an on-off switch. Irony, more of a rheostat. As Glenn Adamson puts it in a catalog essay, the paintings often buckle under the strain of Wood's imagination. He tells stories, but the subtext threatens to overwhelm the script. Take Stone City. Is the story shown here the one that's almost legibly told, quite literally in letters, and also I'd say somewhat literarily, as it's in writing after all, by the larger of the 2 billboards? We see only the backside of the other one. They satisfy, as I've already both shown and told you, those cigarettes advertised. Chesterfields. Wood, incidentally, was a very heavy smoker. I must also tell you, parenthetically, that in The Picture of Dorian Gray, a novel first published the year Wood was born, Oscar Wilde writes, "A cigarette is the perfect type of a perfect pleasure. It is exquisite, and it leaves one unsatisfied." So there's another opposition for you to ponder, satisfaction versus dissatisfaction. As does the landscape here, for which that one billboard can be read as a metonym if you look closely at it and have excellent vision. As does the landscape here seem to have satisfied, I'd imagine, Wood himself. As does the landscape here, I'd imagine, as well satisfy just about any grown-up viewer of the work. After all, it looks so pretty here, so peaceful. Yet those 2 billboards, put together, can also be read, metonymically, as both literal and figurative signs of an all too intrusive and commercial modernity, indicatively urban, that by the early 20th century had invaded all the roadways and also railways of our countryside. Wood picked up the habit of smoking in 1920 while on an extended stay in the city of Paris, where he'd really gone to perfect his impressionist style. He died of pancreatic cancer, though, a disease no doubt exacerbated by the heavy drinking he began to do in later life, and not, as one may have expected, of lung cancer. As such, the billboards exist in considerable tension with all those windmills you see here. This type of windmill, as they were used to provide both farmers and townsfolk with water, is what enabled the very first settlers back in the mid-19th century to settle the Midwest. This type of windmill, I suspect, is also what enabled Wood himself, by climbing up on top of them, to get to enjoy those otherwise seemingly impossible, not to mention dreamy, bird's-eye perspectives that you too get to enjoy, for they really do satisfy in his landscapes. I owe this suspicion, or perhaps insight, to my husband, David Coster, a rather brilliant general surgeon who, like Grant Wood, was raised on a farm in Iowa. Here's a recent picture of him. It's taken in our backyard. I'm the one over by the quilt. It's fun, David tells me, to climb those windmills. Everyone he knew as a kid, both boys and girls, used to do it. Maybe that's why Wood both took, unconsciously, and represented, dreamily, the windmill as his own private metaphor. After all, it is featured quite prominently in that self-portrait of his. Plus, he does seem to have associated, unconsciously, the water supplied by such a windmill, perhaps along with the quite clearly rural gizmo itself, with the sight of some naked male bodies bathing. Or take American Gothic. That title, or paratext, American Gothic, may well be the most literary feature of the work, and it functions crazily very much the way the title Medici slot machine does for that shadow box. Just as Cornell put the Renaissance word Medici before the modern words slot machine, Wood had put the modern word American before the medieval word Gothic. Incidentally, Wood had planned but never did execute a companion piece to be called, I'd imagine, American Mission. It was to have placed a mission-style couple in front of a mission-style or perhaps craftsman-style bungalow. The most dreamlike feature of American Gothic, other than the Gothic-style couple, who, as I've already said, may have represented for Wood alone the artist's sister, mother, and father, the most dreamlike feature is, I think, the barn. For there was no barn next to the odd little house in Eldon, Iowa, that served as Wood's model. The barn here, therefore, may be said to have emerged metonymically from the artist's unconscious. And as this barn, unlike the house, was not also done in what is better known as Carpenter Gothic style, had it been, it might look like this. It may well have been, for Wood, a metonym, or perhaps synecdoche, for all the relatively normal farmsteads, even including that of his own family, which the artist must have recalled both consciously and unconsciously from childhood. As such, it exists, I think, in considerable tension with the house, if not also with the Gothic style and yet for Wood alone oddly familiar couple in front of it. Now, this, I admit, does sound like a pretty perverse thing for me to say. Normally, it is what we sense about ourselves to be abnormal that we repress or hide away from consciousness. Not always, though. Sometimes we repress normal stuff, as some proto-modernists, including Twain, and then many modernists, including Henry James, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf, repress sentimentality for being, allegedly, far too inauthentic, unwarranted, ostentatious, feminine, and therefore gay. As Roland Barthes, a gay postmodernist, like, say, Sedaris, but one almost as closeted in writing as were both James and Proust, as Roland Barthes has said somewhat dreamily in an autobiography of his, let us now imagine reintroducing into the politico-sexual field thus discovered, recognized, traversed, and liberated a touch of sentimentality. Would that not be the ultimate transgression? The transgression of transgression itself? For after all, that would be love, which would return, but in another place. Or take that self-portrait of his. The main literary feature of the work, doubtless, is that it takes the by now easily recognized aesthetic form known as self-portrait. You could even say it takes the one known as self-portrait with spectacles. Here, for instance, is another one done by Rembrandt Peale in 1846. Here's another one, done by Chardin in 1771. But Wood's otherwise literary eyeglasses, as I've already mentioned, are also pretty dreamy. They may have turned this particular self-portrait for Wood alone into a combination of both his father, shown metonymically, and himself, shown iconographically. The windmill, as I have also mentioned already, is dreamy as well, being associated here primarily, and for Wood alone, I'd imagine, with bird's eye perspective. Why primarily? Why not equally with both water supplies and naked men or even just boys washing off? Well, for one thing, the landscape shown behind the figure is presented in bird's eye perspective, even though the figure itself is, of course, not. For another thing, well, just take a look at this. And now take a look at this. Isn't what I myself am now showing you perhaps why we all feel, looking through these eyeglasses of both Grant Wood and his father, Miraval, and into the eyes here, that we can almost feel whatever on earth it is that Wood was feeling, or know whatever it is that he knew, or see what he saw, if only in his not completely conscious mind's eye. And take Death on Ridge Road. Here, clearly, we have a narrative taking place. Here, to invoke Wanda Cornigan, we have a narrative of confrontation. Incidentally, Ridge Road really does exist in Iowa City, where Wood, by 1935, was teaching, like me as of late, at the University of Iowa. Back then, without the bird's eye perspective, it must have looked a lot like the road in the painting. Most obviously, we have a confrontation, or rather, a dreadful confrontation, of two cars going one way around a hairpin turn while a truck coming the other way hurtles toward them. Less obviously, as in Stone City, this also represents a confrontation of an indicatively urban early 20th century modernity with those two then ultramodern cars as with the two billboards in Stone City, and of something else altogether with that truck as with the windmills in Stone City. I say this because although that truck, or rather that barn red truck, looks ultramodern as well, it is also, like the windmills, quite clearly rural. I say this too because it both dreamily and metaphorically suggests the kind of by then old-fashioned barn we saw in American Gothic. Remember though what I told you, that the unconscious per se does not recognize opposition. Who though, if anyone, or perhaps what, if anything, or perhaps where on earth will ever get to survive this particular confrontation? Which of these three literal drivers? Which of these three literal vehicles? Which of these two figurative parts of our country? This work also represents, on a literary level having to do with aesthetic form, a confrontation between two types of death. Insofar as what with those cruciform telephone poles, not to mention the deep shadows and distant storm clouds, insofar as the scene shown here, vehicular homicide, possibly multiple such homicide on some early 20th century road, seems uncannily like, yet also unlike, the scene shown in much older paintings, like this one by Memling, of clearly multiple crucifixions, including that of Jesus Christ, of course, on Calvary. We have an indication of some probably very sudden and also rather pointless deaths, which such deaths, I feel, are being not so subliminally opposed by Wood to all those deliberately dreadful and protracted deaths in days of yore upon the cross, only one of which, according to Christians, was meant to serve a higher purpose. Wood, incidentally, seems to have been inspired by a rather gruesome article called "And Sudden Death" in the August 1935 issue of Reader's Digest. Which type of death is worse, though? The ancient murderous one or the modern accidental one? It's a question, like those others I've just ticked off, that Wood seems to pose poetically in the painting, but never to answer. One final point, so as not to end on such a dreadful, dismal note. I said earlier that Wood's encounter with Memling and others inspired him, or so he claimed, to suddenly renounce his impressionist style. I said, too, that I don't think renounce is the right word for him to have used. I think, rather, that he repressed that style, much as he had repressed sentimentality, perhaps, and also that you could see that style return here and there in subsequent work. As Freud famously said, there is always a return of the repressed, and not just in dreams. More importantly, I think Wood never either renounced or repressed what the critic Jesse Matz, in his recent book, Lasting Impressions, The Legacies of Impressionism in Contemporary Culture, calls the mode of Impressionism. As a mode, he says, Impressionism develops when its basic phenomenological dynamic takes on thematic resonance in everything from unstable pictorialism to narrative and historical elaborations within and beyond the artwork. Most importantly, I think, nor did Wood ever renounce what Jesse Matz calls the dual nature of Impressionism, the duality, that is, or the opposition of real seeing versus personal vision. For what had looked so real at first in artwork by, say, Monet and Cézanne, as in Impressionist novels by, say, James and Wolfe, soon became valuable also for the way it could embody an artist's own sensibility. The same is true, I'm sure we all feel, sentimentally or not, for work by Grant Wood. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to respond to Kevin Kopelson's splendid talk on Grant Wood, art, dream work, and literary work. My thanks to Kevin, the Whitney, and the London Review of Books for sponsoring this talk in connection with the ongoing Wood exhibition and inviting me to participate. Kevin stops where I begin, and it's sort of like a Mobius strip, as you'll see. But before I delve too far into Wood's world of sleepy, if not comatose, Iowa farm towns, towns that often appear as if they have been taken over by spores or aliens, before I consider Wood's dour old men with pitchforks, wearing round-rimmed metal spectacles like your dad's, if you'd had a dad, or the ambiguously virginal ladies wearing cornstarched pinafores edged with rickrack that accompany them. Rickrack, I should say, being a style of barbaric New World spinster ornament last encountered in one's much-loathed junior high school home economics sewing class. Before I consider Gothic barn windows on hallucinatory buildings, indeed, before I explore all the frowsty murals in honor of Ceres, grain-friendly goddess of home and hearth, before I explore the lethal corn cobs, oops, there they are, the daughters of the American Revolution, who may be men in drag. I think Evans says something like that, but before I talk about surreal symmetrical cows being milked by fetching idiot boys in overalls, indeed, before I get to the overalls, and more overalls, everyone has overalls, and then suddenly, more overalls, and then suddenly, no, more overalls. I told you there were a lot of them. Until suddenly, or not so suddenly. No, more overalls. There it is, no overalls at all. Nothing but sweaty nude guys washing themselves, sometimes full frontal, with water drawn from cattle troughs before I discuss, this image on the left is his drawing of Sultry Night, and it was excised from the painted version of the picture. More of his work of depicting the male nude, especially from the back, as in this picture of Kevin's husband, who appears to be wearing no pants at all, or something. Before I begin to talk about the strange, the near psychopath, until I begin discussing the neat psychopathic rows of bobble-headed trees and furrows, haystacks lined up as in Stone City, which according to Wood's trippy biographer, R. Trip Evans, resemble nothing less than gigantic male bottoms. Oops, I have to go back. Yeah, these are out of order. There we go. Gigantic male bottoms, one of which, again in Stone City, seems about to be penetrated by a rogue tree. No, oops, going the wrong way. There it is. Nothing less than a rogue tree from one of the tree clumps that has somehow wandered over from its position in line to the cleft between male mega buttocks. Sometimes, as in a dream, we find whole busloads of trees lining up to cleave the dank cleft yet again. You can see the ones in the back there in the far distance. Over here, they're all sort of, if you see the legs coming from the right top corner, there is a whole lineup there. Got wood, indeed. I must confess that I myself have a much more plausible and rather less salacious theory about these rounded, sloping, seemingly polka-dotted hillsides. Namely, that they are not by Grant Wood at all, but are actually very early pieces by Yayoi Kusama. Oops. Back up. Before I get to any of this allegorical melodrama, or address the obvious fact that Grant Wood lived in his own private Iowa, however, I must pause a moment and lightly chastise Professor Kopelson, the fantasia-ridden Kevin, over his strange urge to invent future writing projects for me, especially, for example, when in the course of looking at Grant Wood alongside fellow artist oddball Joseph Cornell, he somewhat wildly suggests that someone really qualified, Terry Castle perhaps, needs to write about Cornell and Wood together. Why me? Why really qualified at what? And why should I do this when Kevin himself is already writing about them so brilliantly? Which leads me to a very sad self-revelation. Kevin's fantasy, I confess, might have gained more ground with me had it not, to put it so brutally, involved Grant Wood. True, Joseph Cornell has a lot to answer for, maybe even more than Frida Kahlo, in the vast panorama of modern American kitsch, North and South. I speak of those legions of empty nester moms and with it grandmas in Birkenstocks who fill up their leisure time making cut paper collages, crafting their own dubious little mermaid boxes, mermaid shrines, or Cornell-like memory boxes, using glitter guns, photos of baby showers, and butterfly and frog stickers, little prefab trinkets resembling old padlocks, keys, and other antique vintage hardware. Yes, at the Whitney Museum of American Art, I dare speak of them, that vast conglomerate of women artists known as scrapbookers. Yet I myself get along fine with Joseph Cornell and his eponymous boxes, thanks to the presence therein of certain celebrity goddesses I also happen to revere, notably the legendary Hollywood film star Lauren Bacall. I like Cornell's many parakeets and ballerinas, all the, excuse me, I'm getting over bronchitis. Oh. I like them. And the tiny mock stage sets and constellations, and in one of the later works, a photo of an enigmatic doe-eyed person identified only as Susan Sontag, about whom, despite my great interest, I have been able to find very little information. But really, no, not yet. But really, Grant Wood, I can't believe I'm here. Why would anyone think me, the bronchial, nouveau beatnik type girl, ineluctably post-hip, why would anyone think me remotely interested in this plump and appalling specimen in overalls, Grant Wood? It is not just the fact that Grant designed the most hideous lounging chair and matching ottoman in human history, the Grant Wood chair, and you can tell he's a cutout because he's sort of too big. He's out of the scale of the chair. Oops, no, missed it. There we go. Another picture of the Grant Wood lounge chair. Yes, it is not just the fact that Grant Wood designed the most hideous lounge chair and matching ottoman in human history, nor is it the fact that Wood painted what is, without question, the world's most hideous painting, The American Golfer. Breathtaking in its awfulness, even for those of us who have sadly had to adjust our eyeballs to the monster of Mar-el-Lago and his minions. Speaking of which, here is a Grant Wood portrait of our current Speaker of the House, Mitch McConnell. Rather, what gets to me is the plain old lesbophobia. What else could explain the truly un-American, Gothic shenanigans associated with this Wood painting from 1931 entitled The Appraisal? Perusing the profusely illustrated catalog that accompanies this show, I thrilled to find this picture, previously unknown to me, for its seemingly ravishing depiction of a lesbian pickup scene involving a rooster, and a very attractive rooster. I would have preferred a chicken, but it's a perfectly fine rooster. I realize the older woman's face is hard to see. I imagined her as Cate Blanchett. But surely the butch lady in boiled wool coat and woolly pom-pom hat, whose fingers are interestingly splayed in a manner strikingly suggestive of the female genitalia, this butch lady has a look of dykey sensual authority mixed with a witty, intelligent, voluptuous panache, even as the lady in furs would seem to be completing her, no doubt, positive appraisal. Imagine then my pathetic shrieks when I came across online a comment on the appraisal and an explanation of it that Wood had in fact persuaded an artist friend, Ed Rowan, the director of the Little Museum, which I think was in Cedar Rapids, to pose as the farm woman with Rooster. Yes, Miss Pom-Pom is, or was, a man. Not even a trans man, but a man. It won't surprise you to learn the episode has thrown me into a neurasthenic crisis over my sexual orientation, the precise details of which I have now tragically repressed. Yet after all, this, again, bronchial preamble, let me sketch the outline of an idea. After this preamble, it turns out that I do have something to say about Grant Wood, especially in light of Kevin's terrific essay. Let me sketch the outline of an idea in the short time remaining. One of the most intriguing features of Kevin's analysis to me is the richly structuring opposition he draws between the exoteric artist and the esoteric artist, a binarism that might be crudely translated, very crudely by me, as the difference between a Grant Wood who knows what he is doing and a Grant Wood who doesn't know what he's doing. The exoteric artist engages in work that Kevin connects with the literary, the work of writing. That is, the artist begins with some conscious scheme in mind, some more or less organized plan, and unwittingly creates for an audience outside the self, or mostly outside the self. Intentionality, careful thought, attention to aesthetic forms and conventions all guide this creative process, its conscious aim being towards sociability, realism, shared meanings, the possible rather than the impossible. In Wood's case, the exoteric mode often exhibits, too, a demonstrably Christian inflection. The artist seems to see himself as instinctively offering some paradigmatic care and service to others. Paul Revere's ride was nothing but service, if you think from a certain angle, a message delivered to an audience outside the self, indeed a heroic sequence of speech acts, all of them shouted out from the back of a madly galloping horse. That's what I call reaching out. The esoteric artist, however, is a dealer in the dark arts, inscrutability, singularity, the illogical, the subliminal, the libidinally charged, the overdetermined, the uncanny, all those things Kevin calls the dreamy. Like a real dream, the dream that one has, oneself, the esoteric work turns its face away from the group and is produced for an audience of one, the dreamer himself or herself. To wax Freudian, as Kevin does with such refreshing frankness and elan, thank good I'm not the last person believing in the unconscious, the artist may or may not recognize what has come to the surface, for it is nothing less than an archaic symptom, the return of some repressed element in the unconscious. Foregrounded in the esoteric work are precisely those idiosyncratic fantasies and fears long ago relegated to the dark store of the artist's psyche, the opaque souvenirs of desire and dread. Kevin sees Grant Wood, one might argue, as an artist with exoteric ambitions who can't help exposing himself everywhere, it seems, as esoteric in mode. This is what makes his paintings so weird and compelling. He's an improbable fusion of those Kopelsonian opposites, or near opposites, the writer and the dreamer. No doubt Wood has a special way of torquing toward the esoteric, the queer end of the spectrum. To cite one of Kevin's own examples, Grant Wood's well-known self-portrait, this is an early study he did for it, with spectacles, can be said to do two disparate things at once. It fits legibly enough into a recognizable historic tradition, a subgenre of painted portraits initiated in the 16th and 17th centuries, in which the sitters are wearing glasses. Sociably enough, Wood invites us, his collective audience, to compare his effort to those of past masters with whom we might be familiar. It's a conscious gesture on his part, a writerly gesture in Kevin's terms. But Kevin also notes the glasses Wood is wearing were actually those, or at least a reproduction of those, of his stern and somewhat punitive father, whose sudden death when Wood was 10 years old seems to have occasioned in the artist great suffering and a lifelong feeling of traumatic abandonment. There's a gesture there, but it's a wholly private one, and its meaning remains opaque, imponderable. We are not the audience, not the son, not the father. Wood is addressing himself alone. Even knowing a bit of Wood's biography, knowing the fact that these spectacles were his father's or identical to them, the best we can do is imagine a haunting, some hypothetical return of the repressed, but it's someone else's. Given the psychological weight of the father, his power to violate and damage you, to find you out wherever you are hiding, it's easy enough to conjure up some frightful or uncanny E.T.A. Hoffman, Sandman scenario here. The return of a primal dread, but it's one we'll never get to see. And if Kevin is right, perhaps Wood doesn't see it either. Were I to embellish on Kevin's argument, I too would wax Freudian, though would also perhaps be inclined to see things, to turn things in a more Winnicottian, even Alice Miller-like direction, toward the buried thematics of attachment, separation, and loss. Striking to me, extraordinarily so, as I was reviewing Wood's oeuvre in advance of this talk in the catalogue, is his remarkable facility for drawing and painting faces, his own, of course, but even more so, I think, the faces of his portrait sitters. Particularly uncanny is his ability to transcribe subtle facial expressions with an accuracy and delicacy that are also powerfully invasive. It's hard to look away from this, oh no, where's it gone? Just skipped it. Oops, where is she? There she is. It's hard to look away from this frighteningly present instantiation of what the title of the painting promises will be the good influence. But the psychic assault on the viewer isn't simple or reducible to any pre-existing visual stereotype. It's not that we look at a wood painting portrait and decide that the sitter looks happy or sad, pleased or not pleased. I find in them something far more calibrated, something ordinary descriptive binaries can't begin to capture. Wood was especially adept at reproducing his sitter's eyes and mouth during these split-second moments of unusual mobility, notably when the sitter would appear to be between expressions, as it were, changing his or her expression ever so subtly, say from a half smile to a brief frown. And going back to the John B. Turner portrait, he's frowning and smiling or something. In this bizarre, unerring detailing of the face, I have the paradoxical sense I'm meeting Wood himself, as it were, the sitter. I have the paradoxical sense I am meeting Wood himself through the sitter, meeting an avatar or displacement, indeed, of that esoteric or dreamy Grant Wood that Kevin described so well. Wood spoke frankly, as I recall, about working from photographs, even tintypes, while making his portraits. And his portraits can, in fact, approximate the sharp recording of features one might have captured using the ever-improving portable snapshot cameras of the 1930s. There is a realism of a sort. But I think one might also venture a theory that long before he began to paint, if not from an exceedingly young age, the artist must have been an absolute genius reader of human and indeed sometimes animal faces. He saw so well, in fact, so well that what he saw also frightened him. Alas, in the drama of The Gifted Child, I think the cult book of every graduate student in the humanities, alternately titled The Prisoners of Childhood, the psychiatrist Alice Miller famously relates the infant or young child's skill at identifying and understanding faces with extraordinary precision and sensitivity. Paradoxically, she relates this to an attachment disorder, the failure of the mother, her term for the caregiver, the mother to provide the child with consistent mothering, any confidence that her warm, nourishing, and engaged ideal presence, her eye contact and smiles and vocal connection will be constant, always somehow available or reachable. The child who misses out on such mothering, alas, because the mother is erratic in her tenderness, distracted by her own whims and fears, incompetent, physically cold, narcissistic, ambivalent, underinvolved, or somehow just gone, Alice Miller suggests, is likely to develop indeed a neurotic sensitivity to faces, one especially attuned to the mood the face conveys in the moment as a survival mechanism out of a fear, deep fear of abandonment and loss. One becomes a skilled face reader as an adult, in other words, because one could never trust that one's mother would return. One read her face constantly, searching for the signs of her engagement, her love, or the absence thereof. Her blame, her anger, her impatience, her disgust with you, her child. Oops, sorry. you may have deciphered where all this is going. Yes, Grant Wood's paintings are on one level realistic, if not readable, literary in some of their moves, as Kevin has pointed out. Yet at the same time, they bewilder and disturb and even repel us. I think his speaking faces have something to do, perceptually speaking, with the contradictory feelings evoked in his work. Indeed, he has at least two artworks in which he seems to symbolize a phantasmagorical quality in the face and the anxiety that it produces in him. Well, there we go. An almost physical discomfort. Here, the sitter, the adult Wood, cannot turn around or look at the faces behind him. He's left France and come back to Iowa. He can't yet face what? Their disappointment that his attempt at an escape into another life, the life of the artist, the European artist, has failed? Or is it the opposite? Can he not face that he is back in the hands of his narcissistic watchers who want nothing more than to stare at him and make sure, punishingly sure, that he will have to look back at them? The anxiety of the figure who won't look behind him is ours, I think, as well as his. Let me end with a brief, no doubt pathological, exhibition of what I recognize at least, or think I recognize, of Wood's psychic language of the face. Mothers, always looking somewhere else, or made of glass. On the left is a drawing he did for a design for glassware that you see on the right. A Ceres figure who has somehow ignored the human beings but is feeding the geese and so forth. Withholders of love who nonetheless keep you hooked in, as in go away a little closer. Pictures of those narcissistically overinvested in you. They don't see you for who you are. You're a toy or a plaything. Hopeless, too infantile himself to help you. The one who will really mess you up. She smiles, she's alive, she's intelligent, she'll look at you often, then look away. It's good she doesn't really exist. She's an oxymoron. And finally, love's executioners looking right at you. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you both so much for those fantastic talks. I know the program has run a little longer than we anticipated, but we wanted to give the opportunity to ask Kevin and Terry a few questions if anyone has them. We have microphones if you raise your hands. But
They're not looking at us.
No, they're bad parents. Oh, I don't think I'm.
no, you don't have to do anything. You can just talk.
Oh, okay.
But we can also. How long should we play chicken for with the audience?
Well, I actually just want to say,
Yeah.
I think Terry's idea of Grant Wood throughout his career enacting the drama of the gifted child is really, I never thought of it. It seems so right to me based on everything I've read about him.
He's a very sad figure.
Yes, especially later on.
Yeah.
One story I read is that he for 2 summers he had an art colony in Stone City in the early 30s, which meant that he had to live apart from the home he shared with his mother in Cedar Rapids. And she felt so abandoned that she connived with their landlord to tell him that if he kept it up, they'd be kicked out of their home. And that landlord, by the way, was the son of that stern portrait in front of the mouse.
Right, yes.
And as far as I know, he never found out that his beloved mother had this utterly narcissistic scheme to deprive him of happiness and independence. But he probably sensed it on some level.
Oh, we have one question.
Thank you. Just a sort of question or a small elaboration on the point that you made about Winnicott and the women looking away. And it made me think about Winnicott's use of transitional space and how somehow in that looking away is the creation of the unconscious, of which all the paintings are.
Yes, yeah.
So tragic, but also ultimately
something comes out of it, something productive comes out
very
of
rich.
it, but also comes out accompanied by some kind of mourning, as so many adult achievements seem to do. I mean, I just very roughly sketched an idea here. And if I'd had more time, obviously, saying more about Winnicott would have been appropriate, I think, with Grant Wood. I mean, you could even see the spectacles or something as a kind of transitional object. It's almost too easy but
I would add, it's unlikely that many people here are unfamiliar with Winnicott and Alice Miller's book, but in case you are, a great place to start reading about both of them put together is Alison Bechdel's the second volume.
Are You My Mother?
The second volume, which is
completely
all about both of them. And interesting to think about her as a graphic visual artist with that kind of...
She has the same kind of skill, I think, that he has, but she can do it with just tiny partial marks.
So you could write a book about Grant Wood and Alison Bechdel.
Right.
And Joseph Cornell.
And Joseph. He's too readerly.
You know the one woman that Joseph Cornell ever had sex with, or the one person?
Supposedly.
Allegedly. What's her name again?
That Susan somebody?
No, the Japanese artist you had at the beginning.
Oh, Yayoi Kusama.
Yeah.
Okay, well this is fascinating because I heard Susan Sontag.
No.
Okay.
Who'd you hear that from? Susan Sontag?
I might have done. I don't know.
No.
I must have dreamed it.
Not
or
Susan.
It surfaced from some dark...
He was in love with her like he was in love with Lauren Bacall, but...
Oh, right.
No.
But,
By the way, he offered Lauren Bacall that box, and she stupidly turned him down, which she really regretted.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So.
Yeah.
I think I remember hearing that Grant Wood was married briefly, and I wonder if there are any pictures of his wife.
Oh, yeah. You mean artwork?
Of his wife, if he did any pictures of his wife.
So. They were married. She was rather older than he was, and they probably bonded as eccentric artists, and they got together after his mother died, so,
That's right. Yeah.
I don't think he ever did any artwork of her. Marriage only lasted 4 years. He left her, and she, unlike others in his life, kept quiet about her thoughts about anything involving their relationship, which I thought was very impressive.
Yeah.
She's a very interesting character, and I because she said nothing or wrote nothing, I really don't have a strong take on what was really going on in that relationship. And that biography by Tripp Evans covers it as extensively as it can be covered, I think, if you're interested in looking into that. But I'm pretty sure he never painted her.
I don't remember seeing even photographs of her.
Yeah. One problem in the marriage, if you're interested, is that she moved her adult son, sort of a parasitical son from a previous marriage, and that son's wife into their beautiful Iowa City home, and then Grant Wood kind of cathected his new stepson, and his wife could see that he was much more interested in her son. And there were other people invading this household that he was cathecting wildly, and I think it was just too much for both of them. And
Yeah.
so
yeah.
you shouldn't always follow your dream, I think.
Right, yeah. I mean, what do you... Oh, sorry. Okay.
There was a question.
First off, I'd like to thank you both for speaking here today. And secondly, I found it very interesting that you mentioned Nabokov in passing, in a very different context, but still, because his work has often, critics have often had trouble distinguishing the dreamy from the sort of mad aspects of it.
Yeah.
And especially when you look at Grant Wood, and in contrast, if you look at, say, The Starry Nights by Van Gogh, one would call it perhaps dreamy, another would again refer to it as sort of mad or hallucinatory. So if you do draw the line, where would you draw the line in a work of art or in a work of fiction between dreamy and hallucinatory or mad?
Oh.
I don't think you can, really.
Well, you can't. I mean, the unconscious doesn't make any sense in the way we make sense of sense. I don't know what else to say. What do you think?
You're saying so a difference between the dreamy Grant Wood's paintings
And the insane Van
and
Gogh?
insanity. I mean, he's a kind of borderline personality type, it seems to me. But we don't even know how to negotiate that division, it seems to me, anymore, really, if we ever did. You look at some of the sitters in his pictures, I mean, the man in American Gothic, and to me, he looks crazy.
Yeah.
But I don't know what is allowing me to have that thought.
I would add that if madness is more in control than dreaminess, then I don't think you'd find artwork in which the left brain or the literary part is tidying up the mess that the unconscious has created.
Yeah.
You know, going back over it and, you know, smoothing out rough patches or resolving contradictions. If it's more truly mad, there'd be no conscious, sane self coming back in and covering it up all that much.
Yeah. Yeah.
As far as I know, not being insane myself, I'm only guessing here, but this is.
Well, it makes me think a little bit of Todorov's theory of the fantastic, where you see something uncanny, unearthly, and there's a hesitation. You don't know, is it something from another realm that has appeared there, something spectral, or is it something hallucinatory coming from oneself, and indeed something that someone outside you could diagnose? Oh, you've taken a drug, or you've drunk too much, or you're mentally ill, or something. It seems to me with Grant Wood, we're always occupying that space of the fantastic when we look at just about any of his pictures. I mean, there's not one sort of decidedly normal image in any of them, in the sense that, when Gertrude Stein met and got to know Ernest Hemingway, people say, "Oh, don't you admire his writing?" And she says, "Well, yes, of course," and blah, blah, blah. But he is, after all, a Rotarian from Chicago, later Idaho, I guess. That kind of convention-bound ultimate legibility is never, ever going to be there, even when he is depicting, the pillars of the community, the people who have built the community. I guess I may have lost track of your original question at this point, but it's hard for me to, some pictures go more towards realism than others, but even the realistic ones also have another sort of shadow dimension. So the distinction between, I guess, the dreamy and the writerly, or the literary, is one that keeps flipping over. So.
It was interesting for me to see this exhibition because I never thought that Grant Wood was particularly of interest to me. And when I would see one, and it was usually one, I would think, oh, this is kind of amusing. And I was surprised by how when you see a whole show of this work, there's something actually really frightening about it, disturbing about it.
Yes.
And I guess my question was, because I don't know a lot about him, did he, and he seems like a very isolated figure, did he have any relationships outside of the area with other artists? Did he have any correspondences with other artists, or,
I think he did have some. The man who he got to pose for the appraisal with the chicken was another artist, Edward Rowan, and they worked together on projects, sort of community art projects, as far as I know. Also, John Stewart Curry was a sort of fellow artist, Midwestern artist.
It wasn't all doom and gloom. He was apparently a pathologically shy child, but luckily for him, after his father died and they moved from the farm in Anamosa to Cedar Rapids, people appreciated him, and a community of other artists and fans created a space for him to kind of just be his eccentric artistic self. And he figured out a way, despite his shyness, to be sociable. Part of it was he developed a rather childlike persona that invited people or demanded that people kind of take care of him, and a lot of people gladly did that. A number of people were rather annoyed that this demand was being made of them. He, early on, when he was training as a kind of craftsman, worked in various craftsman communities and loved it, and then he tried to keep recreating that, like in the 2 artist colonies at Stone City. And he was beloved by students whenever he taught middle school in Cedar Rapids, and then high school, and then the college students at Iowa. So you shouldn't get the idea that he was terribly isolated and had no friends. He had a lot of friends. So I'm glad that he did. But I still think that.
I didn't actually mean that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
More in terms of location. Like, my sense is that he really lived and stayed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But Cedar Rapids was a happening place. Let me say, it really was. There was a lot going on in visual art and literary culture there, and then in Iowa City too. No, he didn't stay on the farm very long. It was a rather cosmopolitan life he led in eastern Iowa. You wouldn't think it was possible, but it was.
One last question?
Hi. You kind of mentioned in the quote from the New York Review of Books review of the exhibition, it's not necessarily about liking the painting American Gothic. It's kind of always been there. my question is kind of two-part, perhaps. It's kind of a biographical question is, what was the reception when people first saw it, and how did it manifest into this thing that's always been there? And then I guess part two, what do you think personally it is that makes people come back to this painting time and time again?
Well, its immediate celebrity was pretty accidental.
Yes.
You'd have to check my facts here, but I think what happened, it was the standout piece of art in this.
Iowa State Fair.
After that, at the Art Institute.
Oh.
He showed it along with Stone City. I think when that show was reviewed by the leading Chicago paper, they chose American Gothic to be the image of the show, and it may have been a front page review or something. And then I think Time magazine picked it up, put it on the cover. You have to check my facts. I'm at the age where I fabulate a lot. I don't even know it. But then immediately that painting had worldwide fame. And so, but if you look at it, if you try to look at it without any preconceptions, you could see why people would think this is weird. What is this? And so, you know, it's a case in which the mass media did people's thinking for them immediately, like, well, this must be something, and I got to figure out why it's something, but it was the mass media that immediately made it something.
It's also, I mean, it was also described immediately in opposition to European painting, or at least abstract, impressionist, all the modern styles. And so there was a kind of patriotic, I think, relationship that people developed to it, and also to Grant Wood himself.
Which he himself didn't have. He just was happy to ride that wave. And
yes, he did, but he
talk the talk.
Was always presented in the media as a representative of American realism in the way that a lot of his contemporaries who were writers also were trying to get free from the influence of European traditions. Willa Cather, what's his name, Sinclair Lewis, Dreiser, and so on. They're a bit earlier, some of them, but Cather is writing all through this whole period. So something homespun as opposed to sophisticated.
And he just played right along with it in a rather insincere and disingenuous, and I wouldn't even say ironic, way. The craziest thing he said was that he had all his best ideas when milking a cow.
Right.
I don't think he ever milked a cow.
Yes.
And if he had milked a cow, it had to be under the age of 10. And how many profound ideas did he have under 10 while milking a cow? I still think he never milked a cow. But he knew what was expected of him in his role as one of the three leading regionalists.
Yeah,
and,
hence the overalls and so forth.
Yeah. Although, it's funny to look at photographs of him in those overalls, because if they're full length, you see that he's wearing very fancy shoes
Oh, really?
that nobody in overalls would be wearing.
Right.
I have overalls, by the way. I considered wearing them today, but I thought it would be distracting. They're very comfortable. I can see why he wore them. They're very comfortable and fun to wear. I don't think that was he had worn a smock, and he deliberately put it away, probably because he thought it was too European and fancy and possibly effeminate. And and with his celebrity, he was more or less compelled to embody a certain kind of American masculinity, and the overalls did a lot of that work for him, if you didn't look at the shoes.
Or his face, frankly. It's a sort of cherubic, this wispy blonde hair, and then the glasses.
I like the idea of ending on a sartorial note. So thank you again, Kevin and Terry, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.